lecturer in psychology at the Liverpool John Moores University. She did her PhD from Manchester University, and her work broadly has encompassed the human experience and psychology of time perception. And during the COVID lockdown, she has published an interesting paper where she surveyed a lot of people in the UK on how the COVID-19 related lockdowns have affected the daily experience and how it has led to real life time distortions. So without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Ruth to share us more about this very timely and relevant topic that affects all of us and continues to do so. Thank you very much, Ruth.
Thank you very much for your introduction, Sandeep. Okay, so just first of all to say it's really lovely to be invited to do this. It's very rare that I get to talk to lots of people who are genuinely interested in time perception. So today, hopefully, I'm going to be able to give you a bit of a snapshot of how the coronavirus might have influenced our experience of time during day-to-day life. This isn't my normal area of research. I normally do lab-based prospective timing. So this is a bit of a step into the unknown for me, as much as it is, I suspect, for many of us. But hopefully we'll all come away with some ideas for things that we can do in the future, particularly if getting back into the labs proves difficult. So in case it has escaped your attention, there has been a global pandemic, and this global pandemic has affected every single element of everything that we do in our lives. It's affected the way that we go to work, the way our children go to school, the way we interact with our friends and family, the way in which we seek health care and go shopping. So when we have such fundamental changes to our daily life, it stands to reason that we might also experience these changes in the way in which we think about the world, the way in which we experience the world. So our cognitions might change as a result of our lifestyle changes. Now, to give you a bit of background about sort of who I am and what motivated me to do this study, late in 2019, I had my third and final child. So 2020 for me was supposed to be this sort of joyous experience where me and the third baby would relax at home, we'd go for coffee, the other two children would be at school. It was supposed to be some sort of serene spa-like event. And instead, what happened on March the 23rd, I can remember it almost like a flashbulb memory, was that my two older children were sent home from school and they were never going back as far as I could tell. And all of a sudden, I was responsible for caring for these three children, two of them, and all of the other things that we do on a daily basis. And I suddenly became acutely aware of how slowly time could pass. I am sure that there are more than 24 hours in the day, and I'm sure that many of the other people who are currently trying to juggle work and childcare and home life will appreciate what I'm saying. So at first I wondered, oh, is this just something that I'm experiencing? But you can tell from the screen in front of you, this is just a quick collection of memes that time distortion seemed to be quite a widespread phenomenon during the lockdown. It was something that people were talking about in daily conversation. So I was keen to see whether I could get a snapshot of this. Could I essentially take a photograph of how the UK experienced time during lockdown and to try and understand how different people experience time? So were there certain factors which led to a speeding up of time? Were there certain factors which might lead to a slowing down of time? So today I'm going to talk to you about that research that I've conducted. I'm also going to be talking to you more broadly about other research that's been conducted on time perception in the pandemic. So some studies from France and Italy, which have already been published, and also some work that I've been involved in Argentina and in the UK, which currently are unpublished. So hopefully you'll leave with a bit of a snapshot of how the world experienced time, not just how the UK experienced time. So we already know from studies that have been conducted in the 60s that when we have a really significant change in our daily life, we tend to experience a change in our perception of time. So we can look at studies that were conducted by Thor and Crawford, in which people and children on their own, interestingly, were placed into nuclear bunkers for different periods of time. And we can look at the work of Michel Siffre, who went into caves in France for different periods of time. Now, all of these studies were interested in a whole range of different variables and how this period of isolation affected those variables. But one of the things they looked at was sense of time. Now, these studies all showed that when people spent time in isolation, when they spent time away from their normal environment, they lost their sense of time, or their sense of time became distorted. These studies, participants reported that they weren't sure what day it was, they weren't sure how long they'd been in the environment for, they experienced slowing and quickening of time depending on the activities that they were performing. So we kind of already know that significant change to life causes significant change to time. But I suppose what's different about the studies that we've done during the coronavirus and the studies that I'm talking about now is the extent to which we could monitor time. So when Thor and Crawford put people in the nuclear bunker, not only did they take away their normal routine, but they took away all reference to external time. So participants didn't have any watches or clocks. Artificial light was used throughout, so there was no rising and falling of the sun. The same was true for the cave studies. So these studies tell us that things change in terms of our perception of time when we're in a different environment. But what we don't really know from them is whether that's because of the environment or whether it's because we've lost any external temporal marker, any clock, any watch, any sunset and sunfall. So the coronavirus studies present us with this kind of unique opportunity to look at how fundamental change in daily life affects experience of time, but in a situation in which we know time is passing as normal and we can monitor time normally. So if you think about your own lockdown experience, you've still got your clocks on your walls, you've still got your watch on your wrist, the sun is still rising and setting. We know that time is still passing linearly and we can see time passing linearly. But what we don't know is how people are experiencing it subjectively and whether a change in life alone is enough to cause significant distortion to time. So the work that I'm going to talk to you about today focuses on what I would call feel judgments of time. So it's how quickly or slowly does time feel like it's passing in comparison with normal. And this differs from the research that I would normally do, in which I ask people to make estimates of time. So I'm not going to be talking about numerical durations today. I'm not going to be talking about studies which have asked people how long something lasted for. Instead, I'm going to be focusing on what we call passage of time judgments. Now, there are two main types of passage of time judgment, present ones and retrospective ones. So present passage of time judgment is where you just say, how quickly does time feel like it's passing now in comparison with normal? So in this specific moment. Retrospective passage of time judgments are where we say to people, well, how quickly did time feel like it passed today or this week or this month or this year? Both of these judgments are obviously highly subjective, but that's the idea. And both are typically responded to using either a Likert scale or a visual analog scale. So participants would rate their experience of the speed of time, typically on a scale rating from extremely slowly to extremely quickly. So I'm going to talk to you today about research that's been published from the UK, France and Italy. And I'm also going to talk about research that I've been involved in Argentina, research UK. And there are a few things that I'm hoping we'll get sort of a broad idea of by the end of today's talk. So one of the things that I want to try and understand is, well, did the lockdown really affect our subjective experience of time? Was this a global phenomenon? Did it only happen in certain territories? And were there universal effects across the different territories? What predicted people's experience of time? So one of the things that I'm particularly interested in is this idea that we might be able to have a fast lockdown. So how can we make the lockdown feel artificially quicker than it actually was? When we look at what predicts people's experience of time, are these things comparable across the different territories? And this question is actually quite hard to answer, partly because different territories and different research studies have looked at different variables. So it's unclear whether any territorial differences are based on different measurement scales or different measurement variables or cross-cultural differences that may exist. And I think that's something that we could all maybe think about in the future, whether there's a possibility to do a much larger uniform study of this across different territories. And finally, to talk about my most recent study, I'm going to look at how future lockdowns compare with the initial lockdown. So when I started thinking about doing this project, I wanted to try and understand the factors which we know influence real world experience of time. So this isn't my background. My background is lab-based timing. So it was interesting to look at factors which would influence real world time. And I was particularly interested in factors which are likely to have been affected by coronavirus and the lockdowns that are associated with coronavirus. And there were three sort of key variables that stuck out for me: processing load, emotion, and age. When we think about the way in which emotion affects our real world experience of time, we can look at recent studies by John and Sylvie, which have used ESM methodologies. And they demonstrate that in older and in younger adults, we see a consistent association between positive affect, high arousal, and a faster passage of time. So that age-old saying, time flies when you're having fun, well, there seems to be some research evidence basis for that. We also see that the converse is true when we look at Mark Whitman's studies of people being bored, and when we look at clinical studies of people with major depression. So when we have negative affect, when we're depressed, when we're bored, time seems to slow down. If we think about the coronavirus and the lockdown restrictions that have taken place as a result of it, we already know that these have had significant impacts on our mental health and well-being. We see this across the globe in studies coming out on an almost daily basis. So for me, it seemed that it would be important to try and capture a participant's emotional state to try and understand their experience of time. The second factor that I was interested in was information processing load. Now, what I'm going to say now is probably a gross simplification, but it gives you an idea of what we know about information processing and real world experience of time. So generally speaking, what we find is that time seems to pass more slowly when we're engaged require much cognitive effort. So these are typically familiar tasks, tasks that we're very accomplished at, tasks with a low cognitive load. Time passes much more quickly when we're engaged in something with high cognitive demands. So this is something that's very novel and something that's very engrossing. Now, you can see from the figures on the right, which are taken from Flaherty, that this relationship is much more complicated than I'm making out. So, for example, when we're engaged in a very high task demand situation, possibly a task that exceeds our ability to perform, time might slow down again. Generally speaking, this is the pattern that we would expect. These patterns seem to emerge because when we have a low cognitive load, we have more spare capacity to think about time, so time passes more slowly. When we have a high cognitive load, we have less time to think about time, or less cognitive processing to think about time, time passes more quickly. For me, my information processing load hugely increased during COVID. I've gone from not having all the children at home to suddenly have to educate and work and do all the other things. But for other people, I could imagine that the situation would be the reverse. So in the UK, we had a scheme called furlough. So people who weren't able to go to work because their business was closed or their place of work was closed, were still paid by the government, but they didn't have to do anything. They could just stay at home. So you can imagine for this group of people, you might see a reduction in information processing load. So because I thought this would be a very sensitive measure for the coronavirus, something that had changed a lot, this was something that I was keen to look at. And then finally, and perhaps most interestingly, I wanted to see whether different age groups were particularly affected by coronavirus in terms of their experience of time. Now, those of you who've looked into this literature will, I hope, agree that it's quite messy and at times confusing. So if we look at some of the earlier studies on people's experience of time, there seems to be relatively consistent evidence for this idea that time speeds up as we age. So Christmas comes around more quickly every year. However, when we look at the more recent studies by John and Sylvie, we see that this isn't the case. And actually, when we ask people in the present moment how quickly time feels like it's passing, older people and younger people experience time very comparably. In fact, it only seems to be when we look at very old people who are no longer living independently, so people living in residential homes and nursing homes, that we start to see age-related differences in time experience. So that's a recent study by Sylvia in 2019. But interestingly, what we see in these people is rather than time speeding up, we seem to see a slowing of time with increasing age. Now, for me, the elderly have been significantly affected by coronavirus. They're obviously more vulnerable, so this might have emotional impacts for them, but they're probably also less likely to be able to utilize some of the resources that we might use to keep our life more normal. So things like Microsoft Teams, things like Zoom. If you're very elderly, you might struggle to engage with these. So you can imagine that they might be uniquely affected in comparison with other age groups. So with those three variables in mind, I set about trying to capture the UK's experience of lockdown in terms of its experience of time. So we went into lockdown on the 23rd of March, and 2 weeks after that, I released a questionnaire, and this questionnaire was open for a period of about 2.5, 3 weeks. We had 604 participants, a mean age of about 35, and there was two key measures of tension. So this was how quickly people felt today was passing in comparison with normal, and how people felt the week was passing in comparison with normal. And participants responded to these using 7-point Likert scales ranging from extremely slowly to extremely quickly. Now, in line with the things that I was just talking about, to measure people's mood or their emotions, I used the DAS 21. To measure information processing load, I use the NASA TLX, which is a really nice sort of real world measure of how real world tasks influence your information processing load, so how demanding the tasks that you're performing are. But I also wanted to try and get some sort of COVID unique measures. So the thing that we lost in the UK more than anything as a result of coronavirus was our ability to interact with other people in a normal way. So I felt like measuring social satisfaction would be important because this was the key variable that had changed. I also measured physical activity, people's personal risk, so whether they thought they were high or low risk, and the extent to which people agreed that their lives had changed as a result of the coronavirus lockdown. So what did we find? So what we've got here is histograms. The top histogram is showing you passage of time judgment for the day, and the bottom histogram is showing you passage of time judgment for the week. So the first thing to note is that if we look in the middle, the proportion of participants who said that time was passing as normal is small. So approximately 20% of the UK population that I surveyed reported experiencing a normal passage of time during lockdown. So this means that a whopping 80% of our population is experiencing some level of distortion to time throughout lockdown, distortion to time across the day and distortion to time across the week. Now, it's the shape of these histograms that I find particularly interesting. If you'd asked me to predict what the results of this study would have been, I would have expected there would have been a universal slowing of time. I was absolutely amazed when I looked into the data and saw that actually there was much more of an even split. So if we look at the passage of time day and the passage of time week, of people who experienced a distortion to time, so people who said it was different to normal, half of them experienced a slowing of time and half of them experienced a speeding up of time. So coronavirus and the lockdowns that were associated with it, they didn't lead to a universal distortion to time. It wasn't that time sped up for everyone. It wasn't that time slowed down for everyone. Instead, we seem to get this real split of how people experience time. So the natural next step seems to be to try and understand what it was that made lockdown pass quickly for some people and more slowly for other people. When I looked at things like personal risk and gender, there were no significant differences in the experience of time. So people who are high risk haven't experienced time differently to people who are low risk. Males and females haven't experienced time differently. There were, however, some significant effects of age and a number of other variables, which I'll go into in a second, which influenced how people were experiencing the passage of time during the day and the passage of time during the week. So what we've got on the left here are the correlation coefficients. So these are Spearman's correlations, because all the data, the main dependent variables are obviously ordinal data. And what you can see here is there's quite a lot that's correlated with how we experience time across the day and across the week. So as we get older, time slows down. As we're more depressed, time slows down. As we're more stressed, time slows down. And as we're more satisfied with social interaction, time speeds up. To try and understand which of these variables were actually predictive of experience duration, I used an ordinal regression. So I did separate ordinal regressions for the passage of time judgments for the day and the passage of time judgments for the week. Now, what these showed were, if we look at the day in the first instance, that the main predictive variables were a participant's age, their level of stress, how busy they were, so their task load, and their level of social satisfaction, or their satisfaction with the interactions that they're having socially. So a faster lockdown was associated with being younger, with being less stressed, but being more busy, so less bored, I suppose, and having a high level of social satisfaction. A slower passage of time during the day was associated with being older, being more stressed, having a low task load, so being quite bored, and having a low level of social satisfaction. And we can see that the similarities between what predicts your experience of the day and what predicts your experience of the week. So the week, again, is predicted by age and social satisfaction. The older you are, the less satisfied you are with social interaction, the slower your week goes. The younger you are, the more satisfied you are with social interaction, the quicker your week goes. Now, I think it's almost equally as interesting to see what didn't predict our experience of time. So things like anxiety and depression, things that I would naturally expect based on our known relationships between emotion and time experience, they were not predictive of people's experience of time. And I'll come back to that a little bit later on. Also, physical activity, change to daily life, these were not predictive variables. Instead, what it seems is very important is these lockdown specific factors, things like social satisfaction. So it's almost like the thing that we've lost the most of is the thing that is heavily determinant of our experience of time. Now, what's interesting about the social satisfaction scale is that social satisfaction was critical. So it's the satisfaction element here that I'm trying to emphasize. When I looked at whether there was any influence of how many people you lived with, there wasn't. Okay, so it doesn't matter how much opportunity you have for social interaction. So people who lived on their own did not experience time differently to people who lived in larger groups. What was critical was how much you were satisfied by the interaction that you have. So it's really quality over quantity, which is determining our experience of time in this situation. My suspicion as to why depression and anxiety were not predictive is probably because, and this is quite speculative, is that social satisfaction was, I imagine, such a good barometer for well-being. So it was such an acute measure during the coronavirus of how happy you were and how well you felt emotionally, that it simply wiped out any effects of depression. And part of the reason I think this is, as you can see in the paper, they're quite highly correlated with one another. So I wouldn't go as far as saying depression is not related to people's experience of time. But what I'm trying to highlight here is that when we do this real world research, we probably need to be very mindful of the specific circumstances which we're trying to study, because they might be the most predictive factors. Published the UK study, I was contacted by Maria Elena, and she asked me if I was interested in running my study again, or a partial replication of my study in an Argentinian population, to try and see whether we would get any cross-cultural differences in experience of time across the two territories. Now, I of course said yes, and I must hold my hands up now and say this is entirely her work. I have not been involved in the data collection. She's done it all. She's absolutely fantastic. And overnight, she collected 1,200 participants, it would seem. And I say this is a partial replication. So she used all the temporal measures, she used all the social measures that I used, but we didn't take any measures of mood and we didn't take any measures of task load. So the comparisons between the two states are a little more limited, but you'll get the idea for what was similar and what was different. So we were interested in whether there are any cross-cultural differences between the two territories. But one of the things that I'm also interested in is the timing of the two surveys. So Maria collected this data approximately a month ago, I would say. And that's about 6 months into the Argentinian lockdown. So we have data from the UK, which is sort of fresh, immediate in a lockdown. And then we have this data from the Argentinian cohort, which is much further on into a lockdown. So I suppose a secondary question that we can think about is any difference a result of cross-cultural changes, or is it just a result of becoming more accustomed to lockdown? So what did we find? So what we've got here on the right again is histograms showing the passage of time judgments for the day and for the week. And in blue, we have the Argentinian sample. And in orange, we have the UK sample. This isn't new UK data. It's comparison to the published data from the PLOS paper that I just talked about. Now, what you can see straight away here, I think, is that much like in the UK, people in Argentina experience significant distortion to time as a result of their COVID-19 lockdown. So even 6 months into a lockdown, time is still feeling different for the overwhelming majority of people. And 80% of people who experience some distortion to time, 20% of people are experiencing a normal passage of time. And when we look at the territorial differences, what we see is that in Argentina, people were more likely to experience the lockdown as passing more quickly than normal, whereas in the UK, this was pretty split. Just like in the UK, there were no differences in the experience of time for people who are high and low risk from coronavirus. So this really doesn't seem to be a factor in how we experience duration during lockdown. So when we look at the variables which were related to time experience, just to say here that this is just based on correlations, we haven't actually done the regressions yet, so it's quite hot off the press, this data. We see straight away that just like in the UK, we have this negative relationship between experience of time and age. So as our participants get older, they're experiencing a slowing of the passage of time. So there's something about age and there's something about coronavirus which is leading to this sensation of slowing in two territories now. Now, unlike the UK, that was the only thing that was really consistently predictive of people's experience of time. So social satisfaction and change to daily life were not related to people's experience of time in Argentina. People's experience of time across the week was related to their physical activity. So people who did more physical activity experienced a quickening of time in comparison with people who are doing less physical activity. Now, it's really difficult for me to say why these differences occurred. It's hard to know whether they're due to cultural differences. So is there something about societal structure in Argentina which means that we were able to maintain social satisfaction throughout the lockdown? So it wasn't something that was acutely lost in the same sense that it was in England. Or it might reflect the fact that after 6 months, we've just become more accustomed to social interaction in this way, and therefore it's no longer a predictive factor. I think we probably need to do much more research to be able to truly answer that question. But either way, we see consistent effects of distortion. So distortion exists in both territories, and we see a consistent effect of aging. So we can move now to what I think is probably the most comprehensive study in this set, and that's Sylvie and colleagues' absolute behemoth study of the French experience of time during lockdown. So this is part of her broader COVID stress research area, and you can see she's got a very, very enviable sample, over 4,000 participants. So this study measures experience of time in a slightly different way to the ones that I've just talked to you about. So here, Sylvie was interested in asking people about their feelings about the speed of the passage of time. And they did this for 4 different points. So before the lockdown, now in the present moment, today and this week. And rather than using a Likert scale like we did, she used a 100-point visual analog scale. So there's differences in the way in which the data was collected. She also measured a much broader range of variables than I did. So stress, emotion, arousal, fear of death, boredom, anger, quality of sleep, all sorts of things. So it's a really comprehensive assessment of how time is distorted and what has contributed towards it. So when we look at her findings, what we've got here is the figure taken from her PLOS paper, comparing the speed of time in the 4 different points. So before lockdown, now, today, and this week. And what you can see straight away is that there has been a sort of global slowing of time within the French population. So people are experiencing now, today, and this week as passing more slowly than before lockdown. So we don't appear to have this divergence like we did in the UK, where some people are fast and some people are slow. When we look at the average data set, we see much more of a slowing of time. So there appears to be some differences between the 2 countries there. Now, when we look, if we just focus on the left-hand side of the screen for a second, when we look at the factors which influence time in this French population, we can see straight away that almost everything was related to time. So these are correlation coefficients looking at the relationship between the difference in perceived time before lockdown and the difference and the speed of time now. So she calculated a different score and correlated it with all the different measures that she took. So you can see that almost everything is correlated with time, or the change in time. But I think for me, the thing that stood out from this correlation table, again, is this negative relationship between age and speed of time. So yet again, we're seeing greater slowing in our elderly population. So that's across 3 territories now. Because so many things were related to time experience, Sylvia did mediation analysis to try and understand which were the primary factors which were predictive of people's experience of time. And what this showed is that boredom and sadness were the best predictors of a slowing of time. So the more bored you were, the more sad you were, the more you experienced the lockdown as passing more slowly than normal. Things like anxiety and health concerns were not predictive of time experience. So for me, what's really interesting about this study is not so much what predicts time, but all the factors which didn't predict time. And I think if we compare these studies to the UK study, we start to almost see a bit of a pattern. It's the things that we've lost which are predicting our experience of time. It's boredom. We can't go out and do what we want. It's sadness that we can't see who we want. In the same way that it was a lack of social interaction or a lack of quality social interaction which influenced our experience of time in the UK. So again, this is really telling me that we need to be thinking about specifics rather than generals when we study people's experience of time in the real world. So the final sort of published study that I'm going to talk to you about today is an Italian study. So this is going to give us sort of a complete picture of the studies which have been done and conducted across Europe and South America into our experience of time during the lockdown. Now, this study is slightly different to the others that I'm talking about, because from my reading of it, and I'm sure someone can correct me if I'm incorrect, my perception of this study is that it was primarily conducted not to look at people's experience of time, but to look at people's use of digital technology and quality of sleep during lockdown in Italy. So they measured time experience, but it wasn't necessarily their primary variable. And this is reflected in the age of the participants who took part. So we have an age band of 18 to 35. So it's quite a narrow window, and it's not going to encompass the elderly participants, which I think have been quite interesting to look at in the UK, Argentina, and France. So this study measured people's use of digital technology, it measured their sleep, and then it measured their ability to keep track of the weeks and the days, their ability to keep track of time, and any levels of time expansion or distortion. So even in this narrow age group of 18 to 35, we saw significant effects on timing. So people reported an increase in the inability to keep track of time, a significant increase in confusion about what day it was, and they also reported significant increases in time expansion, and this was associated with boredom. So they experienced an association between the feeling of boredom and time slowing down. This was true in students and in people who were working. They also looked at the relationship between time slowing down and the other variables that they measured. And again, the slowing of time was associated with poorer sleep and increased social media, increased digital media use, particularly I think it was in the evening. So when we bring these studies together from the UK, from Argentina, from France and from Italy, I think that we're starting to get sort of a clearer photograph of how time was experienced during the lockdown. It wasn't normal. En masse, people were experiencing some major distortions to their perceptions of time. And this seemed to be predicted by quite specific lockdown factors. So slowing of time was associated with boredom, it was associated with sadness, and it was associated with poor social engagement. Now, we've probably all had our summer in the hope that coronavirus was gone, a false hope. But obviously it's back, and it's back with a vengeance in the UK. So on the 5th of November, we went into a second lockdown in England alone, and this lockdown finishes in 2 days' time, so it finishes on Wednesday. So we had a 5-6 week lockdown, and this lockdown was essentially the same as the previous lockdown. So we're not supposed to go out. We have to work at home. All forms of fun are closed. So no pubs, no restaurants, no entertainment, no unessential shopping. Critically, for me personally, the best thing about this lockdown is that the children are still in school. So it is slightly easier for a large majority of the population. But I thought that this seemed like too good an opportunity to give up on. And I was interested in studying time again in the second lockdown, because one of the things I wondered was, has a second lockdown been experienced differently? So now that we're more experienced with lockdown, now that we've developed strategies to deal with the consequences of lockdown, do we still see distortions to time in the way that we did before? And are there any particular groups who are experiencing time differently? Now, I haven't actually ended this study yet. So the data that I'm showing you now represents about 860 people. I doubt that I'm going to get many more than that, but I thought I would do an initial analysis to give you an idea of what this data is showing up to now. So this was analysed yesterday. So what we've got here are passage of time judgments, exactly the same as before for the day and the week. And you can see, again, we are experiencing, so these are response percentages rather than frequencies. You can see that there is significant distortion to time, even in a second lockdown. So again, about 20 to 25% of people experience time as passing normally, which means that 80 to 75% of people are experiencing time as passing differently to normal in a second lockdown. So even with experience of lockdown, even with a slightly less stringent lockdown, people still experience time differently. And again, we see this sort of divergence in how people are experiencing time. So about half of people are experiencing time passing more slowly than normal. About half of people are experiencing time passing more quickly than normal. For this second study, I added in an additional question about time. So when I released the study, it was 8 months approximately since the first lockdown began. And I was interested in this very long epoch. So how have people experienced that 8 months? Have they experienced it as longer or shorter or about 8 months? So that was an additional question that I posed. And you can see from the results here, hardly anyone thinks that it was 8 months. Only 15% of our population believed that that 8 month period felt like 8 months. Instead, the overwhelming majority, so about 55% of the population, 60% of the population, experienced this as a longer period. So they felt like this 8 month period was longer than 8 months. So we're seeing now evidence for very broad distortions to time as a result of the lockdown. It's not just a day, it's not just a week, it's a whole 8 month period that's been affected by this. However, what's interesting is that unlike the shorter epochs, this 8 month period seems to have a more universal distortion effect. So we're feeling like it's longer. Again, I've tried to look at the factors which are predictive of people's experience of time. So these are correlation coefficients. And I think the interesting thing that jumps out at me first is that we no longer have our effective age. So as we've become more experienced with lockdown, the differences of temporal experience between the age groups have disappeared. We do, however, still have our significant effects of social interaction. So again, the lockdown is passing more quickly, it would seem, for people who are happy with their social interaction. When I did the ordinal regression again to try and understand how the second lockdown was experienced, it's interesting to see that actually the variables are quite different to the ones that were predictive in the first study. So when we look at the feelings for today, so how quickly was today passing, social satisfaction was a critical variable, but unlike in the previous study, level of depression was also predictive, and whether you're shielding. So shielding refers to people who are extraordinarily vulnerable. They were told to just stay in their houses and not go out at all, and they've been like that for a long period of time. There was also a trend towards task load being a predictive factor. So the day is passing quickly in the second lockdown. If you are happy with your social interaction, you've got low levels of depression and you're not shielding. We see a similar predictive factor for our week. So our week passes quickly when we've got high levels of social satisfaction, low levels of depression, a higher level of task load, so we're busy, and when we're not shielding. But when we look at the 8 months judgment, we see something slightly different. So again, we have social interaction being predictive and we have depression as being predictive. But for the first time, we have a situation in which the extent to which our life has changed is predictive. So our lockdown felt longer for people who had poorer social interaction, people who were more depressed, and people whose life had changed a lot as a result of the coronavirus. So for me, what this study raises is this idea that depression has crept up on us. When I was looking before at the mean levels of depression in the first UK study and this UK study, I think the average depression in the first UK study was about 5 on the DAS, but it was about 15 this time. People are feeling much more depressed and much more anxious than they were at the start of lockdown. So maybe it is that a long-standing period of depression is needed to affect our experience of time, rather than a short change in mood that we might have experienced at the start of the lockdown. Oh, my screen is frozen. Let me just see if I can get it back. There we go. Okay. So what do these studies collectively tell us about our experience of time? Well, I think that when we look at them across the board, we see that regardless of how we measure time and regardless of where we measure time, we see significant distortions to time as a result of the lifestyle changes that were imposed to manage the coronavirus. There are some territorial differences which perhaps suggest cross-cultural differences, but they might also just suggest differences in lockdown. So we don't know whether Argentinians experience time passing more quickly because of differences between the UK and Argentina or because of some other differences. There seems to be a consistent effect of age in initial lockdowns, at least. But I think what's most interesting is probably what doesn't predict time. So there's no clear effects of arousal and anxiety. There's minimal effects of workload or change in life, particularly in these first lockdowns. Instead, it's these real lockdown specific factors which seem to be critical, things like isolation and things like boredom. The obvious question is, why did lockdown affect our experience of time? And what I'm going to say in these final few minutes of the talk is probably very speculative, because from my perspective as an experimental psychologist, we have these really sort of comprehensive models of why prospective timing is affected by on a whole range of different variables. But because of the poverty of research or experimental research into real world timing, we probably don't know that much about how and why these distortions to time exist. We could look at something like homeostatic models of time, and we could possibly say that because we know that emotional arousal has an impact on our experience of time, that this might be a way in which time is distorted during the coronavirus. So maybe it is that our ANS activity has been altered and this has caused changes in our experience of time. However, this is slightly problematic for me as a theory that would explain everything, because there are inconsistent effects of stress. There's an absence of an effect of anxiety and an absence of an effect of arousal when you look across all the studies. So for me, a solely emotional arousal based approach to understanding distortions to time in the real world is not sufficient. Perhaps it is that very acute arousal causes real world distortions to time, And maybe it is that depression only affects our experience of time after significant exposure. We need further research to be able to understand these things. Attention to time perhaps offers a better theory for why time is distorted. So one idea is that as cognitive load is reduced, obviously we have more attention to time. This makes time pass more slowly. And we can see support for this in the UK and the French studies. So boredom is predictive of time experience. Task load is to some extent predictive of time experience. And I think if we think about this social interaction variable again, it's almost a barometer for boredom in itself. If you're satisfied with your level of social interaction, that means you're not bored. If you're not satisfied with your level of social interaction, it probably means you are bored. So I think it's also a bit of a barometer for social boredness. So when we're bored, when we've not got enough to do, time seems to be passing more slowly. It's possibly slightly problematic here that stress is not predictive, because I would imagine if we're more stressed, we pay less attention to time, but maybe not, I'm not sure. Thinking about particularly the long retrospective judgments, so how long has this 8 months felt like in comparison to normal? I was expecting, to be honest, that people would say the 8 months felt short, because my initial feelings were, if we think about the way in which retrospective judgments are based on memory, we might think, well, we've not done anything during lockdown. We haven't made any new memories. And therefore, when we look back on it, it should feel like a short period of time. That might have been sort of the silver lining of the lockdown cloud. But that wasn't the case. The lockdown still felt like it was slow. Now, this suggests to me actually that it's not that we haven't done anything during lockdown. It's that we've just done so many things that are new. We've had to fill our time in new ways. We've had to work in different ways. So this has created lots of new memories. There might not be memories that we want, but they're memories nonetheless that exist. And that might have contributed towards a slowing of time. Now, finally, just to touch on a very recent idea by Torin and colleagues, this is based on lab-based work, so it's difficult to take it out into the real world, but they've suggested that distortions to the passage of time might result from prediction errors. So events which deviate markedly from what we expect distort time because of some sort of prediction error, and this influences the way in which time is processed. Now, lockdown has changed our experiences dramatically. So predictions will have been confirmed, but also they will have been challenged by the experiences that we've had. So I think it's very feasible that this might have some real world application. However, the thing that I find marginally problematic for it is that the change of life measures that we have were not predictive. However, maybe it's just that life changed in a predictable way, but specific elements of life didn't meet predictions. We really need to do further research on this to try and understand how these types of variables that we've identified in the lab carry over to the real world. Okay, so just to finish now, going forwards, what can we conclude? What should we do to try and understand real world distortions to time more? I don't know what your experience of working in time perception is, but mine is often that colleagues will say to me, well, why are you studying that? Where's the impact in that? Like, how are you going to change people's lives? And I suppose that that's in some ways a fair comment, but I have this sort of secret desire that one day we might be able to lengthen the things that we enjoy and shorten the things that we dislike. That would be amazing. We could go to the dentist and it feels like we're there for less time than we are. We can go on holiday and it feels like we're there for more time than we are. So how do we get towards that? And that's probably not in my lifetime. Well, we need a better understanding of real world temporal experience. My perspective of our field is that we're very lab focused, and it would be really nice to take some of that focus out into the real world. But I think to do that, we need to probably embrace technology. The studies that I've talked to you about today they're snapshotty. They're not getting really underlying mechanisms. It would be nice to take objective measures of arousal, activity, and potentially even brain activation and look at how they relate to people's experience of time in the real world. Similarly, it would be really nice to use things like VR to try and induce the sort of high levels of emotion that people always talk about when they talk about real world distortions of time. So things like time slowing down during car crashes or near-death experiences. Can we recreate that in the lab with some of the underlying physiological measures to try and really understand the causes of real world distortions of time? This is the type of thing that the public are interested in. It's probably the type of thing that grant funders are interested in. So it would be good to try and collectively work towards this. And these are some of the studies that I've taught today. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much again, Ruth. That was a very, very engaging talk. I'm sure there'll be loads of questions. So if anyone has any questions, please raise your hands and unmute yourself and ask a question. Ruth, would you be available to be online for another 10 minutes?
Yeah, 10 minutes is fine, yeah.
Great.
There is already a hand raised, Philip. Just unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Excellent. Thanks very much. That was a brilliant piece of research.
We cannot hear you. Your connection is breaking up.
You cannot hear me. Okay.
I can now.
You
yes,
can now. So
yeah.
Maybe it's slightly better. If you can. My name is Philip. I'm from the Institute of Philosophy of.
Maybe if everybody can, except Ruth, can turn off their cameras.
Well, I can turn my camera off as well. There we go. And
maybe help a little bit. I don't know.
Yeah, you can.
No, Philip, we cannot hear you.
Okay, well, that's difficult then.
Try one more time.
I have a sort of a positivistic question that.
Sorry, Philip, it's cut out again. I've seen some of the things that you put on Twitter, and I would love to hear your question. So if you could, if we can't get it to work, maybe you could email it to me, and I could send you a response, and also send it to anyone else who's interested in hearing.
Okay, I will email you then.
That'd be fantastic. Thank you.
The other way, also, if you have an Ethernet connection, that will help because wireless connection is a bit slower. So if before we finish, you find an Ethernet connection, that would be awesome.
Any other questions?
Go for it, Mart.
Ruth, hello, thank you.
Hi, Mark. How are you?
Yeah, so I just was thinking about your different mechanistic interpretations of your results. And then I thought, because you mentioned the Sakai model, so with attention, arousal, and all that, but then I thought for interpreting your results, maybe we just have to rely on retrospective time perceptions or memory processes. The only difference might be if, like Droit-Volet asked about having subjective time in the now, how it is now, maybe that's different, but all the other questions, looking back the last day, the last week, or the last 8 months, don't you think that we actually just have to rely on memory processes?